Hello, and welcome to Crosscut Talks virtual sessions, Crisis in Seattle. I'm Mark Bumgarden, the managing editor at Crosscut. I'm coming to you from the Crosscut newsroom at the KCTS9 studios in Seattle, Washington. And in a moment, I'll be handing this event over to two of the most accomplished journalists in their fields for a conversation about Seattle, homelessness, and the coronavirus outbreak. But first, I want to tell you how this event will work. The format is a fireside conversation followed by an audience Q&A, which I'll be moderating. All of you will be muted and chat will be disabled during the event. You can submit questions during the conversation and we'll be monitoring your submissions for the Q&A. Also, we'll be recording this event and we'll send you more details about how to watch it in a follow-up email. Okay, that's it. We'd like to say thank you to Northwest Harvest for sponsoring this event. And we'd like to extend a special thanks to all the Crosscut Festival sponsors. Live events like the festival aren't possible right now, but we'd like to acknowledge their continued support of Crosscut's mission. Trusted information is a vital tool for our community, now more than ever. The Crosscut events and stories you care about are only possible because of donations from our members. Your investment means we can continue to create independent, equitable journalism available to all. No subscription or paywalls ever. Please consider donating at crosscut.com/support. Okay, without further ado, let's meet our guests. First is Miles O'Brien. An independent journalist, Miles is the science correspondent for PBS NewsHour and an aerospace analyst for CNN. He has also produced, directed, and written for Nova and Frontline. Most recently, he produced Coronavirus Pandemic, A Tale of Two Washingtons, a Frontline episode that investigates the response to the coronavirus outbreak with a focus on early measures taken in Washington state. Miles, welcome to Crosscut Talks.
Thank you, Mark. It's a great pleasure.
Joining Miles is Soledad O'Brien, a contributor to PBS NewsHour and HBO's Real Sports with Bryant Gumbel, and the creator of the Black in America and Latino in America series for CNN. She is also the host of the weekly public affairs program Matter of Fact with Soledad O'Brien, and is currently at work on a documentary about homelessness in Seattle. Soledad, welcome to Crosscut Talks.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Okay, it's also worth noting that the two of you have worked together before as co-anchors of American Morning on CNN. So this should be a breeze, right?
The O'Brien.
Easy peasy.
Okay, on with the show.
All right. Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate it. And Soledad, it's great to be with you on the air again. And just to preempt the inevitable question, we are not, well, I suppose all O'Briens are cousins, but we're not married to each other. We're not brother and sister. We're really good friends. And we somehow, way back when, Brian Baru is a common ancestor. I used to always say when we were working together, people, of course, would ask that question immediately. Are you married? And I would say yes. And Soledad would hate that because I would pause and then say, but not to each other. And anyway, and at the time.
So much confusion and
yes,
and you know it did.
I just enjoyed I enjoyed all that. Anyway, it's great to see you. You've been doing really, I think without getting too deep into a former employer, I think both of us have found great and wonderful journalistic projects with our previous employer in the rearview mirror. And I congratulate you on all the good work you've done.
Thank you, and likewise, especially your new doc. How exciting.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I wanted to, we'll talk about that a little bit later. And I must say to all the Seattle people out there, I spent 6 weeks in your city under huge duress. This whole thing about the Seattle freeze, I don't get. I could not have met nicer, more warm people. It was really amazing. Maybe if I come back later, they'll give me a cold shoulder. I don't know. But see, we'll talk about my film in a minute. But I want to talk about your project because in the course of doing what I did, we spent a fair amount of time in the homeless communities in Seattle. And unfortunately, it didn't end up in the final cut of the film, but I did have a little bit of experience sort of understanding the plight of homeless in this situation. And, you know, your project actually predated the pandemic. And I must say, knowing a little bit about independent productions since we left our previous job, when you go in and try to pitch a homeless film, it's not easy, right? I want to know a little bit of the origins of the film that you're working on, and how that has morphed, like everything, since the pandemic.
Sure. We had started working on a film that looked at public health. And we were trying to figure out, well, how do you tell the story about something that in a lot of ways is incredibly amorphous? Like, well, what is public health exactly? Is public health vaccines? Is public health asthma? Is public health just people generally being healthy? What does it mean? We were interested in looking at the homeless population in Seattle and kind of exploring what kind of story we could do around how the city and America is dealing with a very fragile and vulnerable population. And I would say we were 2 days into our shooting when suddenly the main story became COVID-19.
Wow. So 2 days in, you really have to rethink everything, don't you?
Everything. Our director, Rose Arce, she was about to hop on a plane to Seattle to start the work. Our crews were already on the ground shooting, and suddenly our story's focus had changed. And yet, we knew that there was an amazing opportunity to tell the story of a vulnerable population, a population in crisis when crisis strikes again. Because I do think there is, a measure of a community and the measure of a city and the measure of a state and the measure of a country is how they treat their most vulnerable people, right? It's
Absolutely.
that. And so to be able to say, okay, how is Seattle doing when it comes to COVID-19 through the prism of, in part, not only, its homeless population became our strategy. And as you know, because in independent production, you got to find someone to fund you. I think the folks who ended up funding our project, which was the de Beaumont Foundation, which is very heavily invested in public health, what was helpful to us is that they knew this was an amazing opportunity to really use a breaking news story to tell the story of public health. Because again, it's just, what is public health? If I were to ask 10 people, they'd all give us 10 different answers. And we knew this was going to be an amazing opportunity. So this doc will air sometime next month, and we're just in the beginning stages of going through all the content and the file. And I mean, it's been a challenging shoot because, as you well know, right? I mean, it's under a lot of duress, certainly for our crews that are there and doing a lot of stuff for us remotely as we're in shelter in place here in New York. And also really understanding what is a huge issue, not just in Seattle. I think Seattle is the third biggest city with the population-wise, homeless-wise.
Yeah, I think so.
But obviously, in New York City, we have the same issues, and Houston, I mean, every major city is dealing with this. And so it's an interesting way to look at a city grappling with a crisis when a crisis strikes.
So just a quick question. When everything changed, was your funder still all on board? Did they think this was still the right thing to do?
Yeah, and I think we had said, it's such a hard thing to explain to people what public health is. What you really want to do is follow some kind of breaking news story. We sort of said that in passing. And when this happened, we were like, oh gosh, here's the breaking news story. They turned on a dime. I mean, they literally, de Beaumont Foundation was like, yep, this is the way to do it. And I think where they've been very helpful for us is public health is not about the hospital, right? I mean, there's lots of stories about people who are, do they have the appropriate gear, and the doctors and nurses who are saving them, who are amazing. But public health is a different story, right? It's about the health of a community. It's sort of writ larger. And so what we wanted to do, and very much with the help of de Beaumont, was to get in to the public health part of Seattle. Like, we needed access. At a time, Patty Hayes runs it. She's a nurse by training. At a time when the worst thing you could ask Patty Hayes, what the moment she is needed for her expertise is, so could we follow you around with cameras while you're really busy? I mean,
this is when you could get the Seattle freeze, right? At that point, right? Yeah, and it would be justifiable, wouldn't it?
100% justifiable. And you actually hate, Patty runs from thing to thing to thing. I mean, her days are ridiculously long. She's phenomenally
She's a
competent.
great character. I just saw a little bit of her a little while ago. I think she's a great through line character.
And what a great team. I mean, really,
Yeah.
you talk about people who, are just putting it out there to try to make change in their community. But it was horrible to ask. It was horrible to get on the phone to take the time to explain the project.
Yeah, no.
Asked her if we could follow her, and she and her team were amazing and immediately said yes. And so that, we were able to turn very quickly. And so our focus then became the homeless through the COVID-19 crisis, which has been a really interesting sort of framing for us.
I don't know about you, but the older I get, the harder it is for me to make those asks, because I think when you're young, you're stupid enough to just not know. And so it's kind of like, it's tough, but this is what we do. So we should just say a couple of words here. Not every production team could rip up a treatment and start over 2 days in. And this is a testament to your amazing producer, Rose. Give a little shout out to Rose, who I've worked with over the years as well.
Prize winner, by the way, which I always brag about her.
I know how many Pulitzer Prize winning producers do you get to work with, right? And
telling her that if I had a Pulitzer Prize, I'd put it on a big chain around my neck. To want to do that, I don't know.
Yeah, but I mean, the fact that you let's face it, when you work for a place like CNN or in that world, you kind of get a little twitch, and you're able to respond quickly. So you guys turned on a dime, and was it pretty seamless?
Yeah, it was very seamless. And I think because we had a great team in Seattle, as you know, since you've been there, that's really it, right? Who do you have on the ground, and can they do work? And it was scary because we really needed them to be safe. I mean, forget the project. You need them to make sure that their health was a priority. They were trying to capture a story, but also they're shooting people in public health who are dealing with vulnerable people every day. We absolutely did not want to be responsible for some kind of vector of disease to anybody. Yeah. So it was very, very stressful, certainly for Rose, who was juggling a lot. But I know with your project too, you had to turn that around really fast. And again, I think it's most places, and even places that do breaking news, do not allow you to say, I have a proposal, and you turn it out within 24, 48 hours, and suddenly you're shooting. I know the movies make it look like that, but
it's not. That's not the way it goes. I mean, we spent 5 weeks shooting the film, which is, 5 weeks from the day we arrived in Seattle to airing, which is, that might be a record for a Frontline with, an ab initio Frontline, put it that way. And, but, for me, I was quite at home in that environment. That's kind of, some of the editors I work with when I do Novas and stuff, they say, if you had 2 years to do a film, you'd still wait until the last 5 weeks. I was the guy studying, the last, I'm not like you. Soledad is over prepared. Me, I'm just kind of,
we usually do get a lot of time. I mean, I usually have like a year and a half.
Yeah. Well, you're turning this around pretty quickly as well, which is good, because these stories are so important to get in the mix right now. I call it the teachable moment. People are really paying attention. I mean, this pandemic is going to be with us for a while, but we've got to get these stories out there. One of the things that stuck with me, Soledad, I was speaking with the state epidemiologist in Seattle, in Washington State, in Seattle, Scott Lindquist. And, we were talking about these very issues, the homeless as potential vulnerable, because they come into it with so many issues, health issues. And of course, where do you wash your hands? Where do you go to the bathroom? Where do you shower? All these, how do you shelter in place when you have no shelter? There's a million things. And his line that stuck with me, and it's, people have said this before, but when something like this happens, the cracks in our system become fissures, they become valleys. And so this is what was laid bare there when you look at the homeless. And I'm curious, what were the issues? We often talk about the homeless in third person. What did they tell you? What were they saying? What were their concerns?
Well, I think the thing that we've tried to do, and I think we do it well in a lot of our projects, is kind of hand the mic off to the people who are experiencing it. And it's very easy to forget to do that. So we actually, on the show that we do, the public affairs show, we literally track, like, who are we hearing from, and making sure that people who are living that experience are the experts, versus this idea of like, well, Miles, let me tell you.
Right, right. It's easy to do that, right? It's kind of the easy Rolodex thing. You get the expert on there and shoot a little B-roll in the shelter and you're done.
Exactly. And you can be a very good-hearted person and do that. And
Right.
so you constantly have to sort of push back and say, but who are we hearing from? Who's there? Who is the expert? And not the expert with the degree necessarily behind their name, but the expert in the experience. And so our doc right now focuses, we're in the middle of editing it, so all of this could change. But
I know how that goes.
a woman named Stevie who has a daughter who's 11 years old, and she lives in her Honda Civic that she parks kind of in a very safe little corner through the interfaith family shelter system, who've been ridiculously helpful with us through this entire process and have been fascinating to talk to. They have a sort of the organization helps people live in their cars and live in a place that's relatively speaking secure. And so you really get to see kind of Stevie's life in a vehicle while she then drops her daughter at her mom's for a few minutes to clean up. She kind of has to sneak her in because they're not allowed in the mom's lives in Section 8 housing, and then gets her off to school, gets her to the school bus every day. And, for me, it was so poignant to see because her daughter, Alexa, is a typical 11-year-old girl, Years ago, when you and I, when I worked at CNN and we were both there, I remember pitching a documentary that looked at people in poverty. And an executive said to me, like, ugh, who'd want to see that? And you sort of think like,
I hate that.
And
drives me nuts.
We're not even going to name names, Miles, because
no, we don't have to. We don't have to.
but I remember thinking, like, you really don't understand the issue if you think there's some visual. Homeless people are around us, are us. There are people who are working full-time jobs who are homeless, and especially in a city like Seattle, where the rents are very, very high, where things are very expensive. Stevie, was working. She had a job and was living in an apartment, but because the rent was expensive and then she lost her job, she found herself suddenly unsheltered with an 11-year-old daughter who has school. And so we really wanted to hear from her about how she was navigating her life. And we also wanted to understand, it's interesting. She obviously has a ton of anxiety. She's a very funny woman and, just a really lovely person and funny. But as she's trying to figure out the housing situation, she has just so much anxiety about it. And not just anxiety about not being housed at a time when there's a pandemic raging all around her, but also anxiety about being housed, right? There's a weird safety in being with your boyfriend and your daughter in a car. And it was just so interesting to see how she's trying to juggle that. And also, how do you she had a job. She finally was able to get a job doing lice removal, which if you've ever had children with lice, which
I have been there. Yes.
We've all been there. And
yeah,
you are so grateful for someone who helps you, pull out the lice out of some crying child's hair. So she had what was a good job, except of course, in a pandemic, that job doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And so really watching her navigate this temporary housing that she's been able to get, while this pandemic rages around her. She's a big character in our doc. And then of course, Patty Hayes, the head of public health, because she really, what an engine and what a wonderful person, but she really understands this idea of like, her strategy has to be, how do we figure out how to protect the vulnerable? How do I protect these people and also everybody else while this pandemic unfolds around her?
But this really is how we as a society should be judged, right? How and you know what? And the other thing is, especially now, there but for the grace of God, right? We are. So many of us are one emergency room visit away from living in our car in this country. The truth, that is the truth, and it is only that more palpable given the economic hardship that everybody is dealing with now. So, I'm hopeful that. I try to find silver linings. I'm hopeful that people will look at these kinds of issues, maybe with a little more compassion, maybe with a little more empathy as we march forward. I don't know. I can see it going both ways right now in this country. There's great division, but then there's people like you met who are just, determined to, not let this crisis be wasted, as to paraphrase Rahm Emanuel,
Yeah, well, there's a guy we we were talking to named Ty Curley, and his wife is a caterer. So financially, of course, her business stopped. And he's been volunteering and working at the Interfaith Family Shelter. And it's so interesting. We often, and I am so guilty of it as everybody else, right? Which is this idea of, we like to call people who are working in these dire situations heroes.
Mm-hmm.
And so frequently the doctor—
Overused term though, overused term.
100% overused.
Yeah.
And also, I don't think they necessarily see themselves as heroes. You know, I was saying—
Well, of course. The real heroes don't see themselves as heroes, right? Of course, right? Anyway.
You know, I think they also sort of feel like they have to do it. Like
Right.
like the moment has called, but also there's no other alternative. Like they wouldn't necessarily want to do it. You know, you talk to people working in grocery stores, and I would say, I just want you to know, and they're often getting yelled at, right? In my local grocery store, I'll tell you, people who are all freaking out and stressed will come in and yell at the poor guy who's, you know, reshelving things.
I hope not. Even now too, God, you know.
And I said to them, I don't know if this is helpful, but we really appreciate you. We're grateful that you're open. And I think you just are really heroic. And the guy said to me, like, I don't want to be heroic. I don't want to work. Like, I feel afraid. And so Ty is a little bit like that. You know, every day he sort of says, you know, am I doing the wrong thing by going in and volunteering and putting maybe my family at risk? And so I think he's one of those who I think is an amazing hero, who would definitely not describe himself as a hero, and who feels like he has to go in because the work needs to be done, but he's afraid, and he looks in the mirror and he says, you know, I just like, am I a coward if I don't do this? I mean, it's really hard. And again, I think we often paint people like, oh, hero or patriot or this and that, and it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah. See, I mean, you know, it's like, I mean, to use the war analogy is used a lot, but these are the draftees, right? You know, and they can still be heroic, but they may not necessarily, they'd probably prefer to be doing something else, but they step up, right? And that's the key. When you're called upon, do you step up? I remember going down to a homeless encampment in South Seattle, and one of the things that was it was a very tight-knit community, about a dozen homeless people in pretty elaborate lean-tos and shelters. Kind of, I was surprised at how much structure there was. Put it that way. It had a semi-permanent feel to it. But they, interestingly, and this speaks to what you found with your friend who lives in the car. Remind me your name. I'm sorry, the one who's living in the car.
Stevie.
Stevie. Yeah, I'm sorry. So just like Stevie, they did not want to move. And they actually, the volunteers who were with said, you know what, they're right. It's better for them to be here than to be anywhere else, because they really are very isolated as the storm passes, per se. But the interesting thing too was that isolation, the rumors that were running rampant in that camp. I mean, most of them had it in their head that somehow they were going to be rounded up and literally put in a shipping container, and who knows where they were going to be sent to. But there was stuff like that going around. Did you guys run into any of that? Was there kind of this fear that people were out to deport or get rid of people or make them disappear, or use this opportunity to go after a vulnerable population?
No, it's interesting. You see so many people who look at it like, could this moment be made a bigger moment, right? Like there's a woman who we talked to, I'm trying to remember her, Sharon Lee, who runs these tiny houses, villages.
Uh-huh.
And so there's been this sort of slow process to bring those online. And then all of a sudden she was given the order like immediately, and kind of happened extremely fast. And then volunteers had to come in and help with the plumbing and, you know, build it up. And you think, it kind of goes with your question about compassion, right? Is there a moment where people will say, you know, actually there needs to be some kind of structural change, and it happens now, and this horrible crisis becomes a catalyst for something really happening and changing for good? Or can you put a political wedge in there to say, you know, listen, we've now put bathrooms in, where politically that was a huge issue. You know, that was people did not want homeless people to have access to toilets. Well, suddenly the CDC was saying, listen, we recommend in everything. that homeless people have access to toilets, and suddenly you have toilets, right? So you get these weird, I don't even like to use the word victories, but sort of political wins that would have been hard to get in a different political situation. So it's interesting to see. We've seen much more of that, where it's just, that the tiny village has kind of ramped up in a way that I'm not sure you would have seen it before coronavirus. And also back to your compassion question, I don't know. I'd like to think that people who suddenly realize that, there, but for the grace of God, go I would like to think that they say, oh my gosh, I now know what it's like to be worried.
Yeah.
There'll be no toilet paper. I now know what it's like to think, maybe my job could have fired me or furloughed me or whatever. Now that I know, I can look at people who are on the street and feel a certain way, not like, ugh, those over there, but gosh, who are these people and how do we help them? They're community members. It's a mixed
Well,
bag.
there's some, let's face it.
Change and some people don't.
Yeah, there's so much we have taken for granted up to this point. And you're right. So many of these things that we assumed would be okay are now on the line. And to the extent that the real question is, does that put us in a position where we turn inward and become even more selfish, or do we go the other direction? Or do we look at these fundamental issues, which you can't ignore them in a crisis like this, right? When you see the homeless that are, really all that's left in downtown Seattle right now are those without shelter, right? And there's no, let's face it, as large as that population is in Seattle, people train themselves to make them invisible. They choose not to see them, right? And there's no...
The victory, the win is in they've been moved out of this area. Not they were housed, we've solved the problem, but I don't see them anymore. And so I feel good about that.
Exactly. And these are fundamental issues when you have a real estate market like Seattle's. Why we can't find a way to build affordable housing along with the high-end stuff. These are questions, there's so many problems that this lays bare. It's hard to know how to prioritize them. But I'm hopeful that we find, there was a woman in Seattle who's she's the number 4 person, the chief clinical officer at the Providence St. Joseph healthcare system. And, we spent a lot of time with her. She's trying to scramble around, trying to find masks and various PPE. And she actually had a sewing circle at one point, but and she was doing it all without any help from Washington, right? And she said, and I think this is very true, and I think you found a few of these in your piece, in a situation like this, great leadership is not elected, it emerges. And I'm hopeful that that's what we're seeing. Some of the leadership you saw that you documented there, that's the kind of leadership we need. And maybe it will emerge, maybe we'll listen to these people. And
local. I think that people suddenly pretty quickly recognized help's not coming. You and I covered Hurricane Katrina,
Yes.
and how quickly people think like, oh, I thought help was coming, help's not coming. And then suddenly it becomes, okay, what do we have? What resources do we have? What can we pull together? And who emerges as a leader when you're not going to get federal aid? And those who wring their hands and complain about not getting federal aid, sometimes they're very loud, but very rarely does it help solve a problem, right? The person who actually starts the sewing circle starts solving the problem one little mask at a time. And so, I think we've seen that in every crisis that we've covered, and you and I have covered a lot together of, people figure out pretty quickly where the help is going to be, and then they turn inward to solve the problem. And I think Seattle is going to be no different. If they're lucky and they're able to really solve some of the issues that are very challenging in the city of Seattle, they have this opportunity, I think, to be a model, right? The idea of a very, very expensive housing market is an American problem. Seattle's off the charts, but it's an American problem that people really can't afford on a low wage job or on a part-time job, or that they just can't afford to live. And so I think Seattle has an opportunity to, if they can solve the crisis or figure out how to frame it better, to really be a model for other cities who are also dealing with a homeless situation, a major problem.
Yeah. I'm interested, the parallels to Katrina. I've thought about that a lot, especially as I was thinking about doing this event with you, and how, Katrina, as big a story as that was, this is obviously, I don't think you and I are going to cover a bigger story than this one, right? let's hope, right? But Katrina, there's so many parallels because the pitch that I and the film that I produced for Frontline was this tale of two Washingtons, right? On the one hand, you had an area, the Puget Sound area, that became the first. And what I saw from my little perch in Boston was a group of people who were in leadership roles who actually were listening to scientists, listening to the data, and at the center of policymaking decisions were smart people. And what I saw in Washington, D.C., Washington was just the opposite. Decades of minimizing science when scientific data didn't suit ideological or financial goals, it was ignored. And this just, took it into a whole different realm. And so this whole idea of being on the ground and seeing with your own eyes, the sewing circle of people trying to make the PPEs or the emergency room doctor who couldn't even find a mask as she walked in, and then hearing a news conference that same day out of Washington saying, "Oh, everybody can get PPE or whatever," and that was Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job, right? That was only this is a global problem, right? I mean, have you noticed or thought about that much?
Absolutely, right. And I think what worked in Hurricane Katrina was that experts were elevated, right? People were, obviously the geographic area that was affected was much smaller, but there was just this sense of, we need to hear from the experts. I want to hear about hurricanes from the experts. I want to hear about how you solved this problem logistically from the experts. I want to hear about death toll from the experts, who's on the ground. I want to see how families can get repatriated from experts who are now housing these families. I feel like this go around, there's been so much elevation of the voices of people who are not experts at all, who, as you say, deny science and don't want to hear from scientists. And so one thing that we were very interested in was kind of elevating this concept of the country and the world, but America's full of public health experts who do this, and their voices and their what they're doing and their strategies need to be elevated and not chit chat with people, their own personal take on how they feel about coronavirus. It needs to be those who are experts in the field. And so we've tried to contribute that way. It's gotten harder though. That's been a big shift since we covered Hurricane Katrina, that this idea that, anybody can be an expert if they have an opinion on whether or not someone should wear a mask and do they need to social distance or not. They're as likely to get on TV as someone who has their master's in public health. And that is kind of terrifying to me, frankly.
It is. So this is, you and I are pretty much the same vintage. You're much younger than I, of course. But in any case, do you need to get that? Or can you?
No, I don't. I'm trying to figure out.
Anyway. So
remember when my mom called the show once? My mom called in accidentally
on air. She called in our air. It was great. But that was one of the best moments in TV. It was great. Do we have? Yeah, you should. Anyway, that's a classic. If we could find that one on the reel.
It was a terrible thing, but yes, a this in a bad way.
But it was your mom. Come on, you got to pick up for your mom. So I forget what I was saying, but this whole the business has changed so much under our feet, right? And I think so much about, as I watch, not to mention any names of former employers, but 24-hour cable operations and the way they've covered this is very disheartening to me, because what I see, frankly, is just what you're saying on the reporting side of it. We have what is, after all, a very complicated scientific crisis as much as anything, that is covered by political reporters in the White House press corps.
Right, and it's framed as a political story. And by the way, there is a political angle, but
of course.
And a homelessness crisis happening in Seattle or anywhere should not, I believe, and I think you believe, should not be framed by a political press out of Washington.
Absolutely.
And I think it does a tremendous disservice, obviously, to the coverage of public health, because that takes a back seat to, but Senator so-and-so said this crazy thing, but we're going to run with that.
Yeah, no, I mean, you've been, and I've really, really been and I should be more vocal because I'm a huge fan
We
of.
vote for all the O'Briens.
Yeah,
That's-
no, I've always been your fan, but watching your Twitter feed has been really great because you are just calling BS on a lot of this coverage, and the fact that the media is not serving us well is really troubling to me. That they have
I think this is what your doc did, right? You're like, we're going to lay out how this happened and what happened clearly and concisely. And listen, I love journalism. I know both of us love journalism, and that's what I think you have to do it. You have to say, here is the story and here is the context. So yeah, listen, I think, it's an interesting time, and homeless people deserve to have their stories heard. They deserve to have a microphone.
Yes.
They deserve to be the focus of a story in a way that elevates what they have to say, and not just a politician weighing in for them. Public health experts should be given the mic every single day on every single show. We're in the middle of the biggest public health crisis in America over the last 100 years. It's insane that politicians are leading that conversation. But
absolutely. Well, so what can we do as journalists? I mean, you have a very strong voice, and you have caught the attention of a lot of journalists, I know. But I just don't see a full I mean, me, I spent a hunk of my career covering science. Of course, as a history major, I'm a bit of a fraud, but I mean, that's always been my thing. And, there was a time when we had an 8-person science unit at CNN, which was disbanded in one day in 2008, gone. And that has happened at all the other networks. And for the most part, to the extent that there are still newspapers anymore, there are no science-specific reporters. So we have these huge blinding gaps in the media's ability to report this kind of thing in an intelligent way. And, it's really nice that, I can find a home at PBS and do Frontlines and Novas, and you can go to a foundation that is interested in this kind of stuff. But we're still kind of just chipping away at the edges. And I wonder what we can do to make journalism a little more responsible. Because if there's ever a time for journalists to do their job right, this is it, right?
Yeah, I think people will learn some of their lessons. I never think it's fast. It's sort of like the question about compassion for homeless people. One of the people we talked to said, I hope so, but these things don't happen fast. In the TV news version of it, by the end of the story, everyone's mind has been changed. But in the real version of it, it doesn't work like that. And so I think people are losing some of their faith in institutions. And so, I think people who have the opportunity to kind of dig into science and elevating experts, I think we have a real advantage, frankly. It might just take a little while because I think people want to hear from experts. We were doing an interview the other day on YouTube, and it was talking to the public health person in California. And I'm trying to remember her last name, Sarah. She's a doctor. Oh, she's going to kill me for forgetting her last name. But she was running the public health in Santa Clara County. And 6 million people almost have watched that. A 20-minute interview about public health in California.
All right, so there are people out there, they're thirsting for this, Soledad. They are, right? I
absolutely believe that there are these tremendous opportunities where people are just, I want to understand. It's one of the things I liked about your doc. It was like, we're going to walk you through what happened, how it happened, the timeline of it, and where the ball was dropped and where things were done well. We're missing a lot of that clarity because now you have sort of people's opinions on stuff. And I think that muddies the water quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate because, you could make an argument that, we're trained as journalists not to make these definitive statements, but never before has the role of journalism been more important than this time, right? I think it's up there, certainly among the most. And yet, journalism comes into the pandemic with a whole host of pre-existing conditions, right? We are a compromised patient. We are in ICU on a ventilator, and there's a pandemic. And so there's this great irony, this conundrum that people really are thirsting for people who are trying to sort this out and really kind of lay it out like you've been trying to do, like I've been trying to do. But the very creaky business model that existed, such as it was, again, the crack has become a fissure. And these papers and these are enterprises that had any semblance of ad support can barely keep it going. So we need.
Financial model is driving a lot of it, but I think, again, and I'm a nauseatingly optimistic person, I do believe that the financial model will.
There's nothing nauseating about you, Soledad. That is just not true. There's not true. Nothing. Zero.
But I do believe that things shift and change. And, you know, we even see, and we run a production company now, that a lot of the stories that we would have pitched for networks that we work for now are going to other networks, non-news networks, who want to understand the plight of people. They care about the story of homeless people. It's just not going to be on the news. It's going to be on other networks that are doing storytelling and really good storytelling. So I'm often just very hopeful that, you know, there's so many people, at least the thing that I've seen is that there's so many people that we've seen through our documentary who are really working to make change, you know, and in spite of the fact that they don't have a lot of support, and in spite of the fact that the political winds aren't necessarily in their favor, in spite of the fact that corona, virus is now, an added burden to what they're already doing, in spite of the fact that in Patty Hayes' case, members of her team are getting sick and she's still there trying to figure it out. And so anytime I kind of get a little sad about it or depressed about it, I really just meeting these people who always end up in our stories, I feel very hopeful, because again, none of them would say, oh, I'm a hero, focus your doc on me. They would say, I'm just here trying to figure it out. And I think there's a greater good that I can be part of, and I'm going to keep doing it. Yeah,
I think it's the business that we are in, journalism, has shifted to, 8 people in a box, Hollywood Square style, talking about a tweet, right? And frankly, that's a really cheap way to keep an audience, right?
A financial model that makes that work.
It does work, right?
Audiences, honestly, when we look at the show that we do, matter of fact, the top story that we've ever done focused on women who are incarcerated with their children. The second
it was great. It was great.
Puerto Ricans and solar power after a hurricane. And so every time I see that data, I think there are literally millions of people who care about these stories. And this idea that everybody wants people yelling and screaming, the numbers don't actually always support that. So I am really hopeful. I really am.
Yeah, no, it's such a, this is a calculated, ratings business decision by big corporate media to do what they're doing. And our former colleagues are the best journalists in the world. And they're just kind of, unable to really do their jobs and tell the stories in the way that you are able to. And the truth is, I am totally with you. It takes time. It is, it's expensive. You got to get on planes, and sometimes it's got to be an empty plane with a mask on, and you got to be really careful, and you got to go into New Orleans when all the traffic's going the other direction. All those things that we do, but those stories are what people resonate to those stories if you tell them right. I still believe in that. I believe that. Listen, don't you think?
People care about homeless people. I know they do. And not just homeless people, other homeless people. Human beings care about the condition of other human beings. Our job is to make sure that we hand a mic to the Stevies and tell them, your story and explain to us what you're going through. And I think that that's important. And hand the mic to the people who are the public health experts and say, you know what, I'm not going to give my opinion because nobody cares what my opinion is on social distancing. I want your opinion. Oh, Sarah Cody, the Santa Clara public health officer, Dr. Sarah Cody.
No, I mean,
so I'm horrified by that.
That's all right. That's right. I can barely remember my own name most days. So the what you do, the homeless story is so important and so difficult because, first of all, I always feel when I'm around homeless people, I'm very concerned that I'm being somewhat exploitive. I mean, that's always a potential issue as a journalist. You want to make sure that you're not taking advantage of a person who's in a bad way. But the thing that is, it's so easy to, to make them invisible. But what you've done with your film is you put flesh and blood and personality on them. And the more you meet these people, the more they're, just like you. And it does take you to that moment where you think, wow, that could have happened to me. That really could have happened to me. And that's a story that's important to tell. And I think I'm hopeful that, listen, we didn't get in this business to get rich,
But if anybody wants to send us money, please feel free.
yeah, no, we're good. We're good with that. Bring it on. But make sure you take care of KCTS first, because they'll send you a tote bag and all that. That's really important. But no, it's we do this to move the needle. And I just applaud you, Soledad, for taking on stories that not everybody wants to tackle. And I've always been a big fan of yours.
And likewise.
And well, this is the Mutual Admiration Society, the O'Brien.
About us together.
Oh, which means I guess we got to include some other people now. So as a matter of fact, we're going to send it back to Mark, and Mark has some questions from some folks out there. Hey, Mark.
Hey, Miles. Thanks. Fascinating discussion, and the tote bags here are fantastic. Yeah, we've gotten a lot of great questions from the viewers, so I'm just going to open it up. And yeah, we'll keep it going for another 15 minutes or so. So
great.
One of the things that multiple viewers have asked about is, and this is just a data question, just curious if you know what the rates of infection amongst the homeless population are compared to the rest of the population. Did you get a sense in your work with public health officials about really if there's heightened risk for the homeless population?
That's and I'm sorry, forgive me, Miles, but maybe you have the answer. I do not have the answer to that, and I certainly don't have an updated answer to that, but that's a great question.
Well, I do know that it depends on where you find them. And those that are in the shelters, there is an elevated risk. And I mean, it kind of stands to reason, right? And the homeless, frankly, that are isolated in little lean-tos like we saw in South Seattle, the numbers are less at this point. And what King County has done, securing all those motel rooms, those single motel rooms for a lot of the homeless, has helped in many ways. So, but I don't have the hardcore epidemiological stats. It kind of depends on where you find them.
Well, that was a tough one to start, but yeah. That's interesting. I wonder, speaking of those shelters, we have another question about what are the issues that the people who work with the homeless population are facing right now? I'd imagine that you have interacted with a number of them. How are they approaching this crisis?
Yeah, I mentioned Ty Curley, and again, I think he's the guy who says, he literally every morning says, he looks in the mirror and says, am I too big of a coward to go in today? Right? I mean, and wow. Right? And I think he's the guy we'd say, oh, Ty Curley, the hero. And he'd be like, literally every day I have to decide, do I go do this? But this job is important, but am I putting my family at risk? And he's in the same financial situation as so many people. His wife has now lost her job. Really, I think, challenging time for folks, because it actually reminds me a lot, Miles, when we were covering stories during Katrina, right? Like, you're working with police officers, but who are also victims of a storm. Right, so you're working with people who are working with homeless people, but who are also losing their jobs or can't get access to masks and who are afraid at the same time because this crisis is affecting everybody. So I think it's been very, very tough and scary for everybody involved. And I do know that people push back very hard on this idea of hero, but also people are looking at it like, there's an opportunity here. We're going to get bathrooms. We're going to get that push through. We're going to get people in housing in some capacity. And even, I was reading this article where one guy said, I'm going to tell everybody, make them arrest you to get you out of that housing. Now you have housing. Do not leave that housing. Yeah. It's an interesting strategy to think about the political gain at this moment that could be possible because of this crisis.
Well, what is the opinion of another reader or viewer wants to know what's the perspective of members of the homeless population toward coronavirus? Is it another obstacle, another problem amongst many, or is there really a heightened awareness towards the virus?
For Stevie, I think it's, one point where our photographers were shooting with her and she blew a tire. And she literally is like, I don't have $130. Like, how am I gonna fix the tire? And I live in my car. You know, that's what would be an inconvenience for a lot of people, or even just a massive problem. That's a catastrophe for someone who lives in their car and has $30 to her name. So I think her life is so fraught with just challenges every single day. I mean, at one point we're shooting with her and they cancel school. Well, what does an 11-year-old girl do who usually spends the day at school if she lives in a car? You know, I mean, and so when you're dealing with all these major challenges, I think coronavirus is this other terrifying thing that's hovering over here, but it's a little more amorphous and a little more, kind of just unclear when you need $100 for your tire. You know, this is the present catastrophe, and that's the future catastrophe possibly coming toward you.
I would agree that the homeless I spoke with, it's just like one more item on the list for them, on top of, many other obstacles that they have to contend with. And so I think what their risk profile is probably higher than they think, but they got bigger fish to fry in many respects.
We have a viewer, Olaf, who's asking about whether you believe, and maybe you can expand this to the subjects of your work, whether COVID-19 is actually going to elevate the issue of homelessness in a way that might result in a greater focus in trying to solve it.
Yeah, it was sort of what I was talking about, where I think there are lots of people who are sort of saying it's now put the issue on the front burner. Again, many people, and not just in the city of Seattle, but across the nation, sort of feel like, well, if you can't see them, that's a solution, right? Like, move people out of the way, voila, that's a plus. And obviously that's not solving a problem. And so I think there are many people who feel that there's an opportunity to solve a problem, even though it's coming about because of a terrible crisis. Now, at the same time, this terrible crisis is going to put so many financial constraints on a community that the opportunity might be hampered by the costs of what has happened in the crisis. So it's unclear what's really going to happen. But yeah, I think that people do feel like, well, at least, we're having this conversation about this because the vulnerability of the homeless population is a big worry. And we're having a conversation about public health, which happens pretty rarely. So is there a chance that this could move the needle? And I think, again, optimistic people say, yes, there's a chance. There are now bathrooms. People now can wash their hands. That's a change. Is it a big enough change? Can it be funded in a big way? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, a viewer named Howard asked a question that pertains to that, which is this all about money when it comes to the homeless population, or is it also about will? And in particular, the question of money is an important one because money is becoming, it's a different situation now, right? So what is it? Is it all money, or are you finding that there are good solutions out there that just aren't being implemented by way of will?
I think all of these answers, I'm going to guess that Howard knows the answer to this question, right? It's always,
Howard, send it in.
Yeah, Howard, you know the answer, right? It's both, because we know some of the solutions, and not just in Seattle, in lots of cities. And you look at a city like Houston that's actually had a really, a very good ability to help with its homeless population. I mean, some of the things that they've done, which weren't just flooding the zone with money, right? It was about thinking about the problem and bringing people who are all concerned from different areas together to solve it kind of as a team. So the answer always in any problem that's a health crisis, that's a medical crisis, that's a financial crisis, that's a housing crisis, it's always, is there funding? And is there the political will to loosen up that funding to make sure that it happens? Their money is there. It's where's it going to go? And so I think we all know you need political will, and you also need actual funding for it. But listen, when suddenly the political will came to bring the tiny houses up to speed fast, not taking months, which was what was planned, but taking a couple of weeks, it happened. because there was the will suddenly. House people, whoop, we got this project, bring it online now. That was
when I was in Seattle talking to both the county executive Dow Constantine and Mayor Jenny Durkin, both of them remarked at how Seattle has, as you well know, Mark, has a reputation for putting a healthy dose of obstacles in the way of change along these lines. There's fair amount of red tape, some of it with good intentions, but you know how these things get bogged down. And the amount of things that they could do in the way of moving, for example, acquiring the motels to put homeless people in them, or building shelters on soccer fields. All these things happened in lightning fast time because people were leaning forward and saying, we need to put the rules aside here for a moment. So maybe there's a certain amount of momentum or a certain amount of habits that come out of this that lead us to say, wait a minute, maybe we haven't, but maybe we've been a little bit too ossified in the way we've been doing business for too long. And maybe this will instigate some long-term change.
I've got a question from another viewer about journalistic process. Early stages of the crisis, there was a lot of information floating out there, and it was really difficult to confirm. I mean, we know that working in this newsroom here. I wonder, can you tell us about like how you make sure that you have got the story right at a time when there's so much information out there? Do you have any specific examples of things that got knocked down through your process?
Sadly, I've got lots of specific examples of things that got knocked down. I think it's one of the reasons I love documentaries, because the process, even on a documentary you're crashing, the process allows much more time for vetting and going back and fact checking and having more conversations and getting more context. So it really, for the bulk of the work that I do in docs, it's just been, the time is the luxury. I do feel sorry for people who, the minute something crosses a wire or the minute there's some information, right, they need to go live. And Miles and I have both been in this situation where, live, where you're now in front of a camera talking for the next 45 minutes about one sentence that someone thinks they heard during a press conference. That is not an exaggeration. And it's terrifying. It's terrifying because you're trying to do your job well. You want to bring people accurate and factual information. And so there are always things that you can do, right? You can make sure that you have trusted sources. You can make sure that if you're not sure, you don't say. You can make sure that you elevate the voices of experts. And experts often in a crisis will say, let's start with the things we don't know. It's just a framing issue. But some stuff just in the crunch of time gets through. So I've always been very, very grateful to the doc process because, 100 people have their eyes on something and you screen it a zillion times before it airs versus, you're going to run from a presser and hop on the air right away. And I have done that, and I've always found that just very terrifying.
Well, I got to say, when those events have their own kind of adrenaline addiction component to them, and we've all cut our teeth doing that. But seldom, when you look back on them, are you truly proud of them the way you are when you look back at an hour film that you spent some time on. And as I was, we were doing this thing. We were building the airplane in flight on this one, doing a 5-week turnaround film. But I had this, Soledad and I get all the credit. We have this amazing, it takes a village, a big village to make it all work. And I had this huge, awesome team, my own people, and then the frontline team. And they're literally, we're on a Google Doc writing the thing, and they're literally right behind me, putting in the comments. I'm like, just ease up, pal, will you? But the truth is, it's so nice to have that kind of feeling that you're protected by the best in the business who all want to make it right. And no one in that process wants to cut a corner. And I liken the whole process to kind of being on a great sports team. If you could take each individual player and say, that's great, but the sum total of the team is greater than the parts. And you kind of arrive at this product that you couldn't have done. None of you could have done individually, of course. So it's a team sport, and we rely on amazing, talented people to make us look good. And I make sure that I feed them well and provide them gifts that Christmas and do whatever I can do to
On
continue
Friday.
whatever it takes.
Tote bags. Get them
Tote bags. Yes.
Sadly, we are at the end of our time, but thank you so much again, Miles and Soledad. Really fascinating conversation, and really appreciate the work that you're doing, especially on this issue. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
And thanks again to Northwest Harvest for sponsoring this edition of Crosscut Talks virtual sessions. Be sure to check your email for updates on how to view the recording of this session, and for more info about upcoming virtual events. For more conversations with the people shaping our world, check out season 2 of the Crosscut Talks podcast. You can find that at crosscut.com/podcasts. Okay, thanks for joining us. Be safe, and we'll see you again soon.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Miles. Good night,
Bye,
guys.
Soledad. Bye-bye.